"That pistol belongs in a museum, old man." That's what a 26-year-old competitive shooter said to a 78-year-old man standing quietly at the registration table of the Cedar Ridge Handgun Invitational, a worn leather holster on his hip and a pistol inside it that was manufactured before any of the young men around him had taken their first breath. The old man didn't respond. He didn't need to. He just signed his name on the entry form with a hand that was steady as stone and walked toward the firing line while 3 younger competitors elbowed each other and laughed behind his back. What happened over the next 45 minutes would leave every single one of them standing in silence, mouths open, staring at a paper target that told a story no amount of modern polymer and red dot optics could ever hope to match. If you believe that respect has no expiration date, type respect in the comments right now and stay with me. Because this story is going to hit you right in the chest. His name was Walter Demchuk, 78 years old, 5'10", though the slight curve in his upper back from decades of carrying weight both physical and invisible had taken an inch or two from him over the years. He had a full head of silver-white hair, cut short and neat the way he'd kept it since 1966. His face was deeply lined, the skin around his jaw and neck weathered like old saddle leather, tanned from a lifetime of being outdoors. His eyes were pale blue, sharp, the kind that tracked movement the way a hawk watches a field mouse from 200 feet up. He wore a faded olive green field jacket with no insignia, the kind you could pick up at any surplus store for $12, khaki trousers that had been laundered so many times the fabric was soft as tissue, and a pair of brown leather boots that had been resoled at least twice. On his left wrist was a Seiko watch from 1983, still keeping perfect time. On his right hip sat a hand-tooled leather holster, dark brown, the edges worn smooth from decades of use, and inside that holster sat a government model Colt 1911A1, serial number putting its manufacture date somewhere in late 1944. The bluing had worn to a soft grey on the edges of the slide and the muzzle. The walnut grips had been replaced at some point with hand-checkered rosewood panels that had darkened over the years from oil and sweat, and the trigger had been worked over by a pistolsmith whose name Walter still remembered even though the man had died in 1991. It was not a pretty gun. It was not a collector's piece sitting in a glass case. It was a tool. A working, breathing, well-maintained tool that had been fired tens of thousands of times, and could fire tens of thousands more. And it was chambered in .45 ACP, a cartridge designed in 1905 by a man named John Moses Browning, who had understood something fundamental about stopping power, that the modern world, with all its technology and innovation and synthetic materials, had never truly improved upon. The Cedar Ridge Handgun Invitational was held the first Saturday of every October at the Cedar Ridge Sportsman's Club just outside Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. It was a regional event, not enormous, but well respected. About 40 shooters typically entered, ranging from local law enforcement officers who wanted to sharpen their skills to competitive pistol enthusiasts who travelled the circuit of mid-Atlantic matches throughout the year. The format was straightforward. 3 stages. Stage 1 was precision. 10 rounds at 25 yards on a standard B-27 silhouette target, scored on grouping tightness and center mass accuracy. Stage 2 was speed and transition. Multiple targets at varying distances from 7 to 15 yards, scored on time and accuracy combined. Stage 3 was a practical course, a simulated scenario with barricades, movement and shoot/no-shoot targets. Total scores across all 3 stages determined final placement. There was a modest cash prize for first through third, but most people entered for the bragging rights and the camaraderie. The match director was a man named Phil Brannigan, a retired state trooper in his early 60s who had been running the Invitational for 9 years. Phil knew almost everyone who entered. But when Walter Demchuk walked up to the registration table that morning, Phil had never seen him before. Walter had driven down from Scranton, 2 hours each way. He'd left his house at 5:30 in the morning to make the 8 o'clock check-in. He lived alone in a small 2-bedroom house on a quiet street not far from Naog Park. His wife, Margaret, had passed 4 years earlier from pancreatic cancer, and their 2 children, a son in Portland and a daughter in Charlotte, called every Sunday but visited perhaps twice a year. Walter didn't hold it against them. He understood that people had their own lives, their own currents pulling them forward, and he had never been the kind of man to demand attention. He filled his days with routine: coffee at 6, walk to the hardware store or the barber or the VFW post by 9, lunch at home, usually soup and half a sandwich. afternoons he spent in his basement workshop where he reloaded ammunition on a single-stage press he'd owned since 1978, or he'd drive out to a state gamelands range to shoot. He shot at least twice a week, had for decades. The way some men kept their minds sharp with crossword puzzles or chess, Walter kept his sharp with trigger time. He had never entered a formal competition before. He had never felt the need. But 3 weeks earlier, while drinking coffee at the VFW post, a younger member named Danny Kowalski had mentioned the Cedar Ridge Invitational and said, half joking, "You should enter, Walt. Show these kids what a real shooter looks like." And something in that comment had landed. Not because Walter wanted to prove anything, but because Margaret had always told him he spent too much time in the basement and not enough time in the world. And he thought maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to step into the world, even if just for a morning. He arrived at Cedar Ridge at 7:45, parked his 2004 Ford Ranger in the gravel lot, and walked toward the clubhouse carrying a small canvas range bag and wearing the 1911 on his hip like it was part of his body. The morning was cool, mid-40s, the kind of Pennsylvania October morning where the air smells like wood smoke and damp leaves and everything is sharp and clear. The clubhouse was a low cinder block building painted dark green with a covered porch where shooters were milling around, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups, checking their gear, and talking in the easy, confident way that people do when they feel they belong. Walter noticed immediately that he was by far the oldest person present. Most of the competitors were in their 20s and 30s, a few were in their 40s. He saw a lot of modern equipment, polymer-framed striker-fired pistols with red dot optics mounted on their slides, competition holsters made of moulded kydex with adjustable retention, magazine pouches loaded with extended capacity magazines. He saw Glock 34s and CZ Shadow 2s, and Staccato XCs, and SIG P320X5s with titanium nitride barrels and fibre optic sights. He saw shooters wearing jerseys with sponsor logos and wraparound shooting glasses that cost more than his entire outfit. And then there was Walter, with his surplus jacket and his leather holster, and his 70-plus-year-old pistol that held 7 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. He walked up to the registration table where Phil Brannigan was sitting with a clipboard and a cash box. Phil looked up, gave him a friendly nod, and asked if he was entering. Walter said he was. Phil took his entry fee, $35, wrote his name on the roster, and handed him a number card to pin to his jacket. Number 27. Phil glanced at the holster on his hip and said, 1911? Walter nodded. Phil smiled a little and said, Good luck out there. Walter thanked him and walked over to an empty spot at one of the wooden benches along the staging area to wait for the safety briefing. That was when the comments started. Not hostile exactly, not at first. More like the kind of casual, thoughtless condescension that young men sometimes direct at old men without even realizing they're doing it. 3 competitors were standing about 15 feet away, loading magazines and checking their equipment. The tallest of them was named Kyle Breck, 26, an insurance adjuster from Harrisburg who shot USPSA matches regularly and owned more firearms than most small gun shops. He had a Staccato XC in a race holster on his belt, and the kind of easy confidence that comes from being good at something and knowing it. Next to him was his friend Tyler Ross, 24, a gym trainer who had gotten into competitive shooting a year earlier and had already placed in several local matches with his Glock 34 MOS fitted with a Trigicon SRO red dot sight. The third was a quieter, slightly older guy named Marcus Webb, 29, a machinist from Selinsgrove who shot a CZ Shadow 2 and generally kept his opinions to himself, but had a habit of going along with whatever Kyle said. Kyle was the one who had made the museum comment. He said it just loud enough for his friends to hear, though not quite loud enough to carry all the way to Walter's bench. Tyler laughed. Marcus shook his head slightly but said nothing. Kyle glanced over at Walter, who was sitting calmly on the bench with his hands resting on his knees, and said to Tyler, Seriously though, a 1911 with iron sights at a timed competition? That thing holds what, 7 rounds? He's going to spend more time reloading than shooting, Tyler said. Maybe he thinks it's 1975. Kyle grinned. More like 1945. Walter heard them. He had exceptional hearing for a man his age, partly genetic, partly because he had always been meticulous about wearing ear protection, a habit drilled into him not by the army, which in the 1960s had been far less concerned about hearing conservation than it should have been, but by his father, a Pennsylvania coal miner who'd gone deaf in one ear by 40 and had told his son that your senses are the only things nobody can take from you if you protect them. Walter heard the comments, processed them, and dismissed them with the same quiet efficiency with which he did most things. He had heard worse. Far worse. In places where the words were followed by bullets. A couple of young men making jokes about his pistol didn't register on any scale that mattered to him. The safety briefing was conducted by Phil Brannigan at 8:15. Standard rules. Eye and ear protection mandatory at all times on the firing line. All firearms to remain holstered or cased except when on the line. Muzzle discipline at all times. Cold range except during active stages. Phil walked through the 3 stages, explained the scoring, and answered a few questions. Then the first squad was called to stage 1, the precision stage. Walter was in the second squad, so he sat on the bench and watched the first group shoot. They were competent. Some of them were quite good. Kyle Breck was in the first squad, and Walter watched him step up to the 25-yard line with his staccato XC, settle into a textbook Weaver stance, and put 10 rounds downrange in controlled succession. His grouping was tight, maybe a 3-inch cluster slightly left of centre on the B-27 target scoring rings. Kyle nodded to himself as he holstered, clearly satisfied. Tyler, shooting in the same squad, posted a similar group, perhaps 4 inches, centre mass but with one flyer that opened the cluster up. Good shooting by any standard. Competitive shooting. Then the second squad was called forward, and Walter Demchuk stood up from his bench, adjusted the leather holster on his hip, and walked to the 25-yard line. He took position 3, the middle lane. The range officer for this stage was a man named Gary Potts, a competitive shooter himself, and a no-nonsense type who ran a clean, efficient stage. Gary called the shooters to the line, confirmed they were loaded and ready, and then gave the command. "Shooters, you may fire when ready." Walter drew the 1911 from the leather holster in a motion so fluid and practiced that it looked like water flowing uphill. The pistol came out, his left hand met it, both thumbs stacked high on the left side of the frame, and the muzzle was on target before his feet had finished settling. There was no rush, no urgency, just a calm, methodical settling into a stance that looked like it had been carved out of marble. His feet were shoulder-width apart, left foot slightly forward, knees slightly bent, shoulders relaxed. The pistol was an extension of his arms, which were an extension of his body, which was an extension of whatever quiet, deep stillness lived at the centre of Walter Demchuk's chest. He took one breath, let half of it out, and pressed the trigger. The sound of a .45 ACP going off is different from the sound of a 9mm. It's deeper, heavier. It doesn't crack. It booms. It sounds like authority. Walter's first round broke clean. The pistol rocked back in his hands with the kind of controlled recoil that only comes from tens of thousands of repetitions, and he brought it back down onto the target and pressed again. And again. And again. 7 rounds through the magazine. He dropped the magazine with his thumb, caught it with his left hand, and tucked it into his jacket pocket. A habit from a time and place where you didn't leave anything behind, not even empty brass if you could help it. Slid a fresh magazine in from the carrier on his left hip, and released the slide with a smooth press of his thumb. 3 more rounds, controlled, measured, each one following the same rhythm. Breathe, settle, press. The whole sequence took about 40 seconds. Not fast by competition standards, not slow either, just deliberate. When the stage was complete and the line was called cold, the shooters walked downrange with the range officer to check their targets. Walter walked slowly, his left knee bothering him the way it always did when the temperature dropped. He reached his target, number 27, and looked at it. Gary Potts was already standing next to it, staring. He had been scoring targets for years. He had seen excellent shooting. He had seen competitive-level shooting from sponsored professionals who trained 5 days a week. But what he was looking at on Walter's target was something else. 10 rounds, all 10. Inside a cluster that you could cover with a quarter, not a 50-cent piece. Not a $50, a quarter. 25-cent coin, at 25 yards, with iron sights, with a pistol that was 80 years old. The holes were so close together that several of them had merged, creating a ragged oblong opening in the paper rather than 10 distinct punctures. It didn't even look like a group. It looked like someone had pressed a burning cigarette into the target and held it there, dead centre of the X-ring. Gary looked at Walter. Walter looked at his target. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Gary said quietly, "That's the best group I've ever seen at this match." Walter nodded, not with pride or satisfaction, but with the kind of acknowledgement a carpenter might give after checking that a joint was square. It was what it was supposed to be, that was all. Gary marked the score on his clipboard. Perfect. 10x. The maximum possible points for Stage 1, with the tightest grouping he had ever personally witnessed in 9 years of scoring at Cedar Ridge. Word travels fast at shooting range. By the time Walter walked back from the target line to the staging area, at least a dozen people had heard about the old man's group. Kyle Breck heard about it from another shooter who had been watching from behind the firing line. Kyle didn't believe it. He walked over to the scoring table where Gary was logging results and asked to see the scores from Stage 1. Gary showed him. Kyle stared at the numbers. He looked at his own score. Excellent by any standard, but not perfect, and with a grouping that was roughly 3 times the diameter of Walter's. He looked back at Walter's score. Then he looked across the staging area to where Walter was sitting on the same wooden bench drinking water from a metal canteen, the 1911 resting in its leather holster on his hip. Kyle didn't say anything, but the grin was gone. The museum comments were gone. Something had shifted behind his eyes, the way something shifts in a man when the scaffolding of his assumptions gets kicked out from under him and he's suddenly standing on nothing. Stage 2 was the speed and transition stage. Multiple targets at distances of 7, 10 and 15 yards. 5 paper targets arranged in a staggered line. 2 shots on each target, scored on accuracy and total time. This was where the modern pistols with their red dot optics and 15-round magazines were supposed to dominate. This was where the young, fast shooters with their quick twitch reflexes and their grip tape and their thousands of dollars in customized race guns were supposed to leave the old man behind. Because speed is a young man's game. Everyone knows that. Your reflexes slow as you age. Your eyes lose their edge. Your hands lose their quickness. Everyone knows that. Except Walter Demchuk's hands had never been fast. They had always been something else. They had been precise. There is a difference between fast and precise that most people never understand because they've never operated in an environment where the distinction is the difference between living and dying. Fast is reactive. Precise is deliberate. Fast is pulling the trigger as quickly as you can and hoping the sights are somewhere near where they need to be. Precise is knowing exactly where the sights are, exactly where the round will go, and pressing the trigger at exactly the right instant, not a fraction of a second before or after. Walter had learned this distinction in 1968, in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, as a 20-year-old infantryman with the 4th Infantry Division, and he had never forgotten it. You didn't spray ammunition in the jungle, you didn't fire fast and hope. You identified your target, you put your sights on it, and you pressed the trigger once, maybe twice, and then you moved to the next one. Economy of motion, economy of ammunition, economy of life. So when Walter stepped up to Stage 2 and the buzzer sounded, he didn't try to be fast. He was something better. He was efficient. The 1911 came out of the leather, found the first target at 7 yards, and 2 rounds punched through the centre of the silhouette in a rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Boom, boom, transition left. Second target, boom, boom. Transition right. Third target, 10 yards. Boom, boom. A brief pause to reload. 7 rounds gone, fresh magazine, slide forward, and then the 4th target at 12 yards. Boom, boom. 5th target at 15 yards. Boom, boom, holster. His time was not the fastest. It was about 2 seconds slower than the fastest time of the day, which belonged to Kyle Breck, who had blazed through the stage with his staccato like a man trying to outrun his own ego. But Walter's accuracy was devastating. 10 rounds, 10 hits, every single one inside the highest scoring zone. No misses, no flyers, no points down. When the time penalty for points dropped was factored in, and Kyle had dropped 2 shots just barely outside the A-zone in his rush, Walter's adjusted score was within a fraction of Kyle's, and the look on Kyle's face when the scores were posted said everything that words couldn't. During the break between Stage 2 and Stage 3, something happened that would determine how the rest of that day played out. Walter was sitting on his bench, methodically loading magazines from a box of hand-loaded .45 ACP that he had assembled himself in his basement, each round featuring a 230-grain round-nosed bullet seated to an overall length of 1.260 inches and backed by 5.0 grains of Hodgdon tight group powder, because Walter Demchuk did not trust factory ammunition, the way he did not trust anything he had not personally inspected and assembled. Kyle Breck walked over. He stood about 4 feet from Walter's bench and hesitated, the way a man does when he's about to do something that costs him a piece of his pride. Then he spoke. "Sir," Walter looked up. "That group at 25 yards, that's the best I've ever seen." Walter studied him for a moment with those pale blue hawk eyes and then said, "Thank you." Kyle swallowed. He looked at the 1911 in its holster. "How long have you been shooting that pistol?" Walter said. "I got this pistol in 1967, so about 57 years. Kyle's mouth opened slightly. 57 years. He was 26. He had been alive for less than half the time this man had been shooting that single firearm. "You were military?" Kyle asked. Walter nodded. "Army, 4th Infantry Division, Vietnam, 67 to 69, 2 tours." Kyle stood very still. There's a moment that happens to some young men, not all of them, but the ones who have enough self-awareness to recognize when they've been small. When the universe holds up a mirror and forces them to look. Kyle Breck was looking. He was seeing a man who had been carrying and shooting that pistol since before Kyle's parents had been born. A man who had carried it not on a comfortable range with safety officers and scored targets, but in a jungle where the targets shot back, where the stakes were not a trophy and bragging rights but survival, where every round fired was a decision that could end a life or save one. Kyle said, "I'm sorry about what I said earlier, about the museum." Walter looked at him with an expression that was neither angry nor forgiving, but simply level, the way a man looks at another man when he has measured him and found something worth acknowledging. "You didn't know," Walter said. "That's the whole point. You didn't know." And that was all he said. He went back to loading his magazines. Kyle stood there for another moment, then walked back to his friends. Tyler asked him what the old man had said. Kyle shook his head. "Don't worry about it, just shoot your match." His tone had changed. The easy arrogance was gone. Something heavier had taken its place. Stage 3 was the practical course, a simulated self-defense scenario. The shooter started in a marked box, hands at sides, and on the buzzer had to move to a barricade, engage 2 threats at 10 yards from cover, move to a second position, engage 2 more at 15 yards with a no-shoot partially overlapping one of the threats, then advance to a final position and engage a single steel popper at 20 yards to stop the clock. Movement. Accuracy under stress. Decision-making. This was the stage that separated recreational shooters from people who had actually trained under pressure, and it was the stage where Walter Demchuk showed everyone at Cedar Ridge who he was. When the buzzer sounded, Walter moved, not fast, not the explosive sprint of a young athlete. He moved with purpose. 1 step, 2 steps, 3, and he was behind the first barricade, the 1911 already in his hands, his body bladed behind the wooden frame with only his shooting arm and half his face exposed. The kind of instinctive use of cover that isn't taught at a weekend carbine class, but is taught when people are actively trying to kill you, and you learn very quickly that the difference between concealment and cover is the difference between living and dying. He engaged the first 2 targets, 2 rounds each, clean, center, no wasted motion. He moved to the second position, and this was where the no-shoot target was placed, a silhouette representing an innocent bystander, overlapping about 30% of the threat target behind it. Most shooters at this match would take an extra half second to get a clean shot past the no-shoot. Some would rush it and clip the no-shoot, earning a massive time penalty. Walter didn't rush. He shifted his angle by about 6 inches, opened up a clear lane on the threat's exposed head and upper chest, and put 2 rounds through it so precisely that the no-shoot didn't have a mark on it. Then the second threat at 15 yards, 2 rounds, clean. He moved to the final position, and the steel popper stood 20 yards downrange, a metal silhouette about 18 inches wide. Walter planted his feet, extended the 1911, and pressed the trigger once. The popper tipped backward with a sharp metallic clang that echoed off the tree line like a bell. Timer stopped. The crowd behind the firing line, and there was a crowd now, because word had spread and people had walked over from the clubhouse and the parking lot to watch the old man with the 1911 erupted. Not with screaming or yelling, because this wasn't a football game, but with a kind of low, charged murmur that runs through a group of people who have just witnessed something exceptional. Heads shaking, low whistles, a few people clapping. Phil Brannigan, who had been standing behind the line watching the whole thing, later told someone that in 9 years of running the Cedar Ridge Invitational, he had never seen anyone clear the practical course with 0 points down and only 1 round on the steel. Most shooters needed 2 or 3 shots on the popper. Walter had needed 1. And his movement through the course, his use of cover, his transitions between positions, it was textbook. Except it wasn't textbook. Textbook is what you learn in a class. What Walter had shown was something that had been burned into him by experience so intense and prolonged that it had become part of his nervous system, part of his muscle and bone, part of the way he breathed. When the scores were tallied, Walter Demchuk had won the Cedar Ridge Handgun Invitational. First place, overall. Not first place in a senior division, not first place for his age. First place, period. Ahead of Kyle Breck by 11 points. Ahead of every shooter with a polymer-framed wonder gun, and a red dot optic, and a $50 grip module, and a resume full of regional match placements. He had done it with a pistol that was 80 years old, iron sights that had never been changed, 7-round magazines, and a leather holster that didn't have a single adjustable feature. He had done it with nothing but 57 years of practice, and a bond with a firearm that most people would never understand, because most people had never depended on a single object for their survival, the way Walter Demchuk had depended on that 1911. Phil Brannigan presented the awards on the covered porch of the clubhouse. Small ceremony, envelopes with cash prizes, handshakes, a few photos. When he called Walter's name for first place, the applause was genuine and sustained. Walter walked up, shook Phil's hand, and accepted the envelope and a small wooden plaque. Phil leaned in close and said something that only Walter could hear. Walter nodded, and for the first time that day, something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, something deeper, a softening around the eyes, an exhalation. Phil stepped back to the microphone. They had a small portable PA system, and said, "Folks, if you'll indulge me for a moment, I like to learn a little about our winners when I can. I spoke with Walter just now, and he gave me permission to share something." The crowd quieted. Phil looked at Walter, then back at the crowd, and said, "Walter Demchuk served 2 tours in Vietnam with the 4th Infantry Division. He carried that 1911 as a sidearm in combat for nearly 2 years. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor and 2 Purple Hearts. He spent 4 months at Walter Reed recovering from wounds sustained in the Ia Drang Valley, during an engagement in which his platoon was outnumbered 3-1, and Walter personally carried 2 wounded men to an extraction point while under fire. He's been shooting that pistol for 57 years, and today, at 78 years old, he outshot every single one of us." Phil paused. "I think that deserves more than a plaque." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Kyle Breck started clapping. It was slow at first, deliberate, and then Tyler joined, and then Marcus, and then the entire crowd, all 40-something shooters and spectators and range staff, standing on the porch of that cinder-block clubhouse in the October cold, clapping for a 78-year-old man who hadn't come to prove anything but had proven everything. Walter stood with the plaque in his hand and his eyes fixed somewhere in the middle distance, somewhere past the tree line and the rolling Pennsylvania hills, somewhere that might have been 57 years ago, or might have been right there in that exact moment, because for a man like Walter Demchuk, the past and the present had never been entirely separate things. The 1911 on his hip had been there for all of it. Every firefight, every sleepless night, every Sunday morning at the range, every year of marriage, every holiday, every loss. 57 years of a man's life, carried in a leather holster that was wearing out just like he was, except neither of them had quit yet. After the ceremony, something unexpected happened. Kyle Breck approached Walter again. This time he wasn't alone. Tyler and Marcus were with him. Kyle held out his hand and Walter took it. Kyle said, "Sir, I want to ask you something, and I hope it's not out of line." Walter said, "Go ahead." Kyle said, "Would you be willing to teach me? Not just shooting, the way you move, the way you think about it. I've been shooting competitions for 4 years and I've never seen anyone do what you did today." Walter looked at him for a long time. He looked at Tyler and Marcus standing behind him. He looked at the 3 of them, 20-something years old, fit and eager, and carrying the same kind of potential energy that Walter had carried once, a long time ago, in a different world. And something in Walter's chest, something that had been quiet for a very long time, stirred. Not pride, something closer to purpose. He had spent 4 years alone in that house in Scranton, loading ammunition, shooting at paper targets, talking to Margaret in the kitchen even though Margaret wasn't there anymore, And here were 3 young men asking him to share what he knew, to pass something down, to connect the past to the future in the way that only knowledge, given freely from one generation to the next, can do. Walter said, "I'll tell you what. You come up to the range near Scranton some Saturday morning and bring your pistols and an open mind. I'll show you what a man named Staff Sergeant Roy Harding taught me in 1967 on a firing line at Fort Benning. He taught me that a pistol isn't a weapon, it's a promise. A promise that when everything else fails, your rifle jams, your squad is scattered, the world is falling apart around you, you still have one thing you can count on, but only if you've put in the work, only if you've practiced until the fundamentals are in your bones." He said, "Demchuk, a man's sidearm is his last line. Don't you ever let it down, and it won't let you down." I never did. 57 years. I never did. Kyle nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Tyler looked at the ground, blinking. Marcus, the quiet one, the one who had never made a joke about the old man or his pistol, was the one who finally spoke. He said, "We'll be there, sir, next Saturday." Walter nodded. He picked up his canvas range bag, adjusted the leather holster on his hip, and walked toward the gravel parking lot where his 2004 Ford Ranger was waiting. The October sun was high now, burning off the morning chill, and the trees along the ridgeline were on fire with colour. Orange and red and gold against a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted. Walter opened the driver's door, set his bag on the passenger seat, and paused for a moment, his hand resting on the steering wheel. He thought about Margaret. He thought about what she would have said if she'd been there that morning. He could hear her voice clear as a bell, the same voice that had welcomed him home from Vietnam in 1969, that had held him together through the nightmares and the silences and the decades of carrying things he couldn't name. She would have said, "See, Walt, the world still needs you. You just had to show up." He started the truck and drove home. Truck and drove. The 1911 rode on his hip the whole way, the same way it had ridden for 57 years, still ready, still faithful, still there. The next Saturday, Kyle Breck and Tyler Ross and Marcus Webb drove 2 hours to Scranton and spent the morning on a public range with Walter Demchuk, learning things about trigger control and sight alignment and breathing and mindset that no YouTube video and no competition class and no red dot optic could ever teach them. They came back the Saturday after that, and the Saturday after that. By November, 2 more young shooters had joined them. By December, the informal Saturday morning sessions had become something that resembled a clinic, with Walter standing behind the firing line in his faded olive jacket, watching, correcting, encouraging, and occasionally, when a student put together a truly excellent group, nodding in that quiet, understated way of his that somehow meant more than any trophy or applause ever could. The word about the old veteran at Cedar Ridge had spread through the regional shooting community. People talked about the quarter-sized group at 25 yards. They talked about the one-shot popper. They talked about the way he moved through the practical course like a man who had done it for real because he had. And they talked about what Phil Brannigan had said on the porch that October morning, about the Bronze Star and the Purple Hearts and the men carried to extraction under fire, and they said it the way people say things that matter, quietly, respectfully, with the kind of weight that words carry when they're attached to something real. Walter Demchuk never entered another competition. He didn't need to. He had found something better than a trophy. He had found a purpose that Margaret would have approved of. He had found a way to take everything he had learned, everything that had been given to him by men who were no longer alive, on firing lines that no longer existed, in a war that most people his student's age knew only from movies, and pass it forward. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, cold or warm, he was on that range, teaching. And the 1911 was with him, the same way it had always been with him. Because some things don't become obsolete. Some things don't belong in museums. Some things, and some people, just keep getting better with time, as long as you don't make the mistake of counting them out. The next time you see someone old and quiet and worn at the edges, carrying something that looks like it belongs to another era, do yourself a favour. Don't laugh, don't assume, don't judge, because you don't know where that person has been, you don't know what that person has done, and you don't know what that person can still do. That 78-year-old man with the antique pistol and the faded jacket might just be the most dangerous, the most skilled, and the most honourable person in the room. And if you're smart, you'll ask him to teach you. If you're really smart, you'll listen. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that respect isn't given by rank or age or appearance. It's earned by the life you've lived and the people you've stood for. Hit that subscribe button, and I'll keep bringing you stories like Walter's. Stories about the quiet ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who still carry the weight and never ask for thanks.